Well, hello, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And we are on McDuff Lives 2 for the rest of the year here as the strikes expire on our main channel, McDuff Lives 1. And hopefully we can all find McDuff material by just looking at McDuff Lives on YouTube. Also, my archive at McDuff Uncensored on BitChute. And follow me if you aren't already on Twitter at Late Driver is my handle there. Yeah, why Late Driver? Because I grew up on Late Drive. Simple as that. And good to have you guys with me this morning. I see we have Corky. Oh, thank you for joining us, Corky. I think you do deserve an award as my most faithful subscriber and supporter and a person who I care a lot about. Laura, you're here too. It's good to have you with me. And starting off with a small crowd on a Monday morning. I didn't get my notice up very early, so that's probably my fault. Anyway, we're going to do some reading this morning from Anton Chaikin's latest book, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1, 1750s to 1850s. So he's covering about 100 years. We are approaching the second half of the book, and actually we've passed the center mark by skipping a couple of chapters, which I apologize for, but I cannot possibly read the whole book, so we will persevere here. And this is where we left off last time. We're talking about John Quincy Adams and his support of Henry Clay and what we now call the American plan or the American system. And it is the system which is, I thought, promoted very, very well by Richard Freeman on a video that he did on Twitter. I just saw it this morning. The idea is to promote growth, to promote progress, to promote actual industry. I almost said industrialization, but that's kind of a dirty word now because we think of pollution and blight. But what we do need is real, honest industry that is increasing the value of raw materials into finished products and using our resources to the advantage of our country as opposed to staying in that colonial mode where our resources simply get exploited and taken away from us while we do all the extraction. And that is the model of the current financial system that's trying to take over the world. And we are the ones that are trying to stop it. We are the Ospreys, if you will. We are the McDuff Brigade. We are the opposition to this British Atlantic system. And enough said about that. Design for Civilization, the Western Canals, page 308. The set of government-sponsored artificial waterways that began with the Erie Canal is in effect changed North America's geography, nullifying the Appalachian mountain chain that had made large-scale Western settlement impractical. Through these coordinated projects, the nationalist leadership started up a new industrial heartland, stretching from the Atlantic coast through New York and Pennsylvania into the upper Midwest. Railroads came along some years later, greatly strengthening this national industrial backbone. These projects resulted in the powerful growth of the northern, non-slaveholding states. Quote, the spirit of improvement, unquote, cited in President Adams's 1825 annual message, had been the public mood throughout America for the previous decade, including in the southern states. But the Virginia and South Carolina oligarchs gained increasing control over southern politics beginning in the late 1820s. and the Southern economy devolved, by their design, into mere raw material production as an integral part of a global imperial cheap labor system. New settlers poured into the wilderness of Ohio after the War of 1812, anticipating the construction of a cheap water transport route between that new state and the Atlantic coast. Ohio elected Ethan Allen Brown governor by a landslide in 1818. Brown had been trained in the law as Alexander Hamilton's clerk and student in New York. Governor Brown created Ohio's Canal Commission. He formed a tight partnership with DeWitt Clinton to promote and engineer the New York and Ohio canal systems as a unified national enterprise. The two leading canal commissioners, Alfred Kelly, a Cleveland pioneer lawyer and state senator, and Micajah T. Williams, that's Micajah, Micajah T. Williams of Cincinnati, the Speaker of the House in the Ohio legislature in 1824 to 25, ran all aspects of the development of the two great Ohio canals connecting Lake Erie with the Ohio River. Both Kelly and Williams were advocates of Henry Clay's American system. They worked with DeWitt Clinton as their partner and confidant. Williams inspected the entire length of New York's partly completed canal in 1823, studying its engineering and construction methods, and taking Clinton's counsel on Ohio's financing and credit prospects. Ohio honored Clinton for his help. On July 4th, 1825, the New York governor turned the first spadeful of dirt for the Ohio and Erie Canal, which was to run from the Ohio River at its confluence with the Scioto River up the eastern side of the state to what was at that time the little village of Cleveland on the shores of Lake Erie. Well, we all know the destiny of Cleveland, right? It's all got Rockefeller written all over it. But this is before that. On July 21st, Clinton broke ground for the Miami and Erie Canal, which would run up from Cincinnati on the Ohio River in the state's southwestern corner through the village of Dayton. Wow, how many times have we discussed the village, now city of Dayton, connecting through the later developed Wabash and Erie Canal to the site of what was to become the city of Toledo on the western end of Lake Erie. 3 months later, with Ohio's two great canals under construction, DeWitt Clinton and a procession of boats left Lake Erie and glided 363 miles on the completed Erie Canal across to Albany and down the Hudson River to New York City, where on November the 4th, Clinton ceremonial poured a keg full of water from the Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean. The New York project was immediately a dazzling success. It brought into being the great industrial cities of Buffalo and Rochester. It cut the cost of long-distance shipping from $100 down to $5 per ton, thus increasing producers' net revenue while cheapening consumer costs, thus helping New York become a manufacturing power and America's commercial center. It also ensured that investors in New York and other state bonds would feel confidence in the vast profitability of these enterprises to society, and thus in the safety of their investments. Ohio financed its $5 million canal construction through bond sales in the East. Though the projects promised to set in motion exponential economic growth, the cost of servicing the debt was initially a burden on a new state with very small government revenue. The Adams administration and its friends in Congress stepped in to make the enterprises financially stable. The U.S. Land Grant Act of May 24, 1828, donated around 2,000 square miles of federally owned Ohio land, which the state could sell to settlers and businesses along the canals, thereby generating the funds to pay interest and principal on the canal bonds. A previous such federal act in 1827 had enabled the state of Indiana to open construction of its monumental Wabash and Erie Canal, which would be built some years after the Ohio venture. President Adams's mission conception was purely Promethean. On July 4th, 1828, shortly after enactment of the Ohio land grants, he broke ground for the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal and said, quote, "At the creation of man, male and female, the Lord of the universe, their maker, blessed them and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. To subdue the earth was therefore one of the first duties assigned to man at his creation, and now, in his fallen condition, it remains among the most excellent of his occupations. To subdue the earth is preeminently the purpose of this undertaking. We pray for this joint effort of our community, that he, that meaning God, by capitalizing the H, that he would make it one of his chosen instruments for the preservation, prosperity, and perpetuity of our union." Unquote. That a prayer offered by President Adams, John Quincy Adams, at the groundbreaking of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. The great projects of that era would have been impossible without the National Bank. Nicholas Biddle managed the Bank of the United States so as to elevate the power and living standards of the United States. Nicholas Biddle being one of the 6 individuals identified earlier in the book, whose detailed biography I passed over. So here he is, and the chief official of the Bank of the United States and managing our economic development. During that period of amazing transformation, economic growth was uninterrupted, and there was a stable national currency. The bank invested directly in canals, roads, railroads, and coal and iron enterprises, and loaned money to states and cities engaged in infrastructure development. Of more importance to national progress than its direct investments, the bank managed credit so that funds from within the United States and from overseas constantly flowed into needed and productive activities. Biddle steered the bank's intervention in markets to stabilize prices of commodities and securities, to weather financial disturbances, and protect farmers, manufacturers, and infrastructure under construction. All of this would have been to no effect had the Bank of the United States not kept speculators from destroying the economy. A very important point that we look at today and see what's happening as a result of unregulated speculative banking. By its charter, the bank received and protected the deposits of the United States government's funds, primarily customs duties. An importing merchant would pay the amount due at New York or other customs depot. Customs officials would immediately deposit this payment in the New York or other branch of the Bank of the United States. Often the merchant would pay with circulating notes from some private or state bank, notes which were allegedly redeemable in gold or silver by the issuing bank. Biddle and his staff, vigilant against unsafe speculative emissions or outright fraud, might take notes quickly back to the issuing bank and demand the promised hard money payment. Notes and credit issuers were thus held to reasonable banking practices, protecting the government and the entire community. The critical observer will note the striking differences between the purpose of that banking function and today's Federal Reserve Bank, which drains the wealth into the global speculative whirlpool. Birth of the industrial Midwest. The Ohio-Erie Canal was completed in 1832. The Miami and Erie Canal was finished in the 1840s. Their enormous effect began immediately with the commencement of the projects and can be seen in the birth of the major industrial cities they brought about. Cleveland, a village of 1,000 people in 1830, grew rapidly after completion of the Ohio and Erie Canal. Akron was founded in 1825 at the highest elevation point of the developing Ohio and Erie. The name is Greek for summit, as in Acropolis. The 1827 completion of the southern portion of the Miami and Erie Canal began the growth of Dayton. It also gave Cincinnati its great surge in population, 10,000 in 1820 to 25,000 in 1830. And industry. The city of Toledo came into existence because its site was chosen for the Lake Erie joint terminus of Ohio's western and Indiana's main canal. Enactment of the 1827 federal land grant to Indiana started up that state's great project. After a few years' delay, the Wabash and Erie Canal. That Indiana project provided a route through the forest for people, raw materials, and manufactured goods. Construction began in 1832, 5 years after the federal land grant. It took 20 years to dig a trench 60 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 468 miles long, connecting Toledo, Ohio on Lake Erie and Evansville, Indiana on the Ohio River. It created the industrial city of Fort Wayne, nicknamed Summit City from its highest position on the canal, connecting it to the East Coast and the Mississippi River Basin. It, quote, quickly invigorated the state's commerce and population and led to the growth of Peru, Lafayette, Terre Haute, and other cities along the canal's route. The state's population increased sevenfold over the canal's existence. The Act of March 1827, which began the Indiana Canal, also granted 290,000 acres of federal land to the new state of Illinois to finance construction of a canal connecting Lake Michigan with the Mississippi River. This Illinois project had world historical consequences, including the creation of the city of Chicago out of the lakeshore mud. Its birth must be understood as an enterprise driven entirely by the intentions and actions of the nationalist leadership, who fought for it over decades and finally saw it through to its dramatic success. The idea for the canal first arose in the mind of the French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet, who in 1673 was investigating the Mississippi River according to the program of French Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert for control of France's North American territories. Joliet discovered that a tributary of the Mississippi, known as the Illinois River later, and its tributary, the Des Plaines River, was only a short land portage away from another stream, later known as the Chicago River, that flowed into Lake Michigan. Joliet proposed that a canal might somehow be cut across this portage to facilitate faster travel from the east to the Mississippi. It, of course, could not be done in that wilderness. A century and a half later, in 1816, Army engineer Stephen H. Long, General Swift's protege, and again, General Swift is one of the 6 characters mentioned earlier in the book to be studied, left his post at West Point West Point's mathematics instructor to be assigned into explorations of the interior of the continent, from the Ohio River to the Mississippi. Long reported back in 1817 with an action plan to create a harbor on the marshy lake shore of the Illinois Territory and to build a canal that would link Lake Michigan directly to the Mississippi. Now, quoting, Chicago River is merely an arm of the lake. Its entrance into Lake Michigan is obstructed by a sandbar upon which the water is only about 2 feet deep. The difficulty of removing this obstruction would not be great. Piers might be sunk on both sides of the entrance and the sand removed from between them. By this means, the river would be rendered a safe and commodious harbor for shipping, a convenience which is seldom to be met with on the shores of Lake Michigan. A canal uniting the waters of the Illinois with those of Lake Michigan may be considered the first in importance of any in this quarter of the country, and at that same time, the construction of it would be attended with very little expense compared with the magnitude of the object. It would be necessary to construct locks at the extremities of the canal, which would connect it with the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River. Illinois was admitted to the Union in 1818 with its borders adjusted so that the entire proposed canal would be within the state's borders. Secretary of War Calhoun officially transmitted Major Long's report to Speaker of the House Henry Clay in 1819. In 1822, Congress granted Illinois the land, the right-of-way, on which to construct the canal, but the state had no means to finance it. With Adams in the White House and Biddle at the bank, the way was clear for the great 1827 land grant to provide funding. But Illinois was still not able to push the project forward until the future U.S. President Abraham Lincoln entered the picture. The 25-year-old Lincoln was first elected to the state's legislature in 1834 as an apostle of Henry Clay and his American System program. He led a delegation of pro-national legislators from Sangamon County, all of them tall, known as the Long Nine. Under Lincoln's guidance, the state finally enacted in 1836 a bill to appoint new commissioners and commence cutting the Illinois and Michigan Canal. The little city of Chicago was incorporated the next year in anticipation of the canal's completion. Actions by President Andrew Jackson and his successor Martin Van Buren to cripple government-sponsored development brought on a deep economic depression in 1837. The Illinois and Michigan Canal's construction was stalled and fell into disarray in the early 1840s. The project would at length be revived, and with it, Chicago would rush forth to its status as the monumental center of America's agro-industrial power. The project was completed in 1848 under the leadership of Army engineer William H. Swift, the younger brother of Joseph Gardner Swift. William Swift was attending West Point as a cadet, without much distinction, when Major Stephen Long reported back from his Mississippi-Illinois reconnaissance. General Swift arranged for William to leave the academy and accompany Major Long on an extended scientific exploration across the wild Great Plains into the Rocky Mountains. Toughened and educated in this nation-building adventure as Long's assistant, William Swift went on to brilliant success as an Army engineer, building canals and railroads and geodetic mapping for the United States Coast Survey. The story of how the Illinois Canal Project was finally rescued was told by General George Washington Cullum, that's C-U-L-L-U-M, an old Army engineer whom President Lincoln appointed superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Cullum compiled the biographies of most 19th century West Point cadets. Cullum wrote of Captain William Swift, quote, "From 1843, Swift was appointed a commissioner upon the Illinois and Michigan Canal, designed to unite the waters which flow into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, that is the Atlantic Ocean, with those which empty into the Gulf of Mexico. Several plans for a canal had been proposed by various commissioners, but not till 1836 were any efficient measures adopted. But in 1841, for want of funds, labor was suspended. In 1843, the governor of Illinois was empowered to negotiate for its completion a loan of $1.6 million to be redeemed by the sale of lands and by tolls from the canal. At this time, Captain Swift was appointed as assistant commissioner with Governor John Davis of Massachusetts to examine the project of this canal and in order to determine the practicability of its completion within the amount of the proposed loan. The Secretary of War, having authorized Swift's acceptance of the responsible trust for which he had been selected, the commissioners within 2 years reported favorably upon the completion of the canal for the amount of the loan, which was taken by Barings of London and other bankers. Of course, and this is me talking, underneath of all of this text is the underlying question of, does the United States become indebted or controlled by the British banks like Barings and Rothschilds and the Bank of England by taking loans from them? You know, the old saying is, if you owe somebody enough, money, they control you. Um, so anyway, the success of the negotiations to secure the loan was greatly due to the business tact, engineering experience, and upright character of Swift, who in 1845 became president of the Board of Trustees. This great work, so wisely, judiciously, and economically administered without the loss of a dollar, will ever stand as an enduring monument of Swift's sterling integrity, engineering skill, and fertility of resource amid every difficulty. For his was the organizing brain and directing hand of the board from its conception. That completes the quote from General George Washington Cullum. Upon the Illinois and Michigan canals' completion in 1848, Chicago became a seaport of both the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles inland from either body of water. That's the significance that I never really saw of Chicago, is that it is the connector between the St. Lawrence Seaway and that access to the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River. That's why Chicago was so important. The city was thereafter a global magnet for population and industry. Railroads began connecting it to the east in the mid 1850s. Chicago, whose creation was a successful national and state project, would soon become the world's most important railroad hub and would be America's second largest city by 1890. Another comment that I have to make is, when we see the involvement of the federal government and the Corps of Engineers in arranging, financing, issuing bonds, doing the construction, doing the engineering, doing the planning, you see that at that time, people were not afraid of the corporate control. They were more interested in getting the job done. Let's get the canal built. If we have to borrow from Barings Bank, borrow from Barings Bank, but get the canal built. And that was the spirit that industrialized the Midwest and created, a potential for a national economy and a coast to coast vision of John Quincy Adams to rule basically the entire North American continent. The Empire of Liberty, as Thomas Jefferson famously called it. Pennsylvania builds for the national future. Urged along by a canal crusade orchestrated by Matthew Carey and Nicholas Biddle, and pressed by the resolute action of neighboring states, Pennsylvania enacted legislation from 1824 to 26 to build a large array of public works. Construction began in the 1820s and was completed in the 1830s. The publicly funded canal system included the, quote, main line, unquote, connecting Philadelphia, the Atlantic seaport on the Delaware River, with Pittsburgh, the state's industrial gateway to the west on the Ohio River. Canals, whose principal objective was the development of the anthracite coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania. Canals connecting Pittsburgh up to Pennsylvania's port town of Erie, and canals along the Susquehanna into New York State and Maryland. The main line comprised a railroad west from Philadelphia 82 miles to the town of Columbia on the Susquehanna River. Canals north and west along the Susquehanna and Juanita rivers, Juniata rivers, should say. I never ran into that word before. Juniata. I suppose they say Juniata. An inclined plane lifting canal boats over the Allegheny Mountains, and a canal west to Pittsburgh. The state also chartered in 1824 a canal to connect the main line through northwestern Pennsylvania across into Ohio to intersect the as yet unbuilt Ohio and Erie Canal. It was constructed in the 1830s with funding from the state of Ohio and private subscription from Philadelphia. These connections westward from Philadelphia enhanced Pittsburgh's rapid industrial progress. Trade and population movement through these canals and through the later publicly supported Pennsylvania Railroad had a profound strategic political effect. They helped to extend the influence of Philadelphia's American system, industrial nationalism, into the neighboring Midwest. This would be especially important later in the 19th century when pro development Pennsylvanians and their allies in Ohio and Chicago fought to sustain national progress in the face of Wall Street's growing power over American strategy. Interesting, isn't it? You can just think of it as the tension I just mentioned between those that want to create America and those that want to create private wealth through speculation. Pardon me. The government-built anthracite carrier canals worked in tandem with the state-chartered private works on the Schuylkill and Lehigh rivers and with the Morris Canal through New Jersey. Together they developed the areas of Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Reading, and the Lehigh Valley as an enormous new resource base for the United States. It should be noted that Matthew Carey pressed hard for the choice of canals as opposed to as yet untried railroads, but within a short time he was won over to the future of rails. Nicholas Biddle also pushed for the canal projects, but Biddle was from the first a prescient and deeply knowledgeable rail advocate. Now, this caption I think is important. American railroads were public projects. You think of all the private profit that's been made on the back of these public projects. It's astounding. It is now nearly 2 centuries after the invention of railroads. Though Britain preceded America in railroad technology by a few years, U.S. rail development quickly expanded into a national network whose mileage surpassed all of Europe. Railways were the arteries of the extraordinary 19th century U.S. industrial progress. They collapsed in the post-industrial disaster of the late 20th century. Yeah, I mean, we lived through that, the collapse of our railroads. You know, it's been an ongoing tragedy in my life why we can't have a high-speed rail to get from Washington, D.C. to New York. Why? Well, it's not just a lack of willingness. It is policy. It is the subversion of our nation into an opportunity for the already rich to enrich themselves further through speculative schemes. Well, this is interesting. I just found out that my audio's been muted all morning. No sound all morning, and I was so sure I had it right that I didn't even look at your comments. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm embarrassed and I'm going to have to shut the this stream off because all of that reading I just did. Hang on a second. It was only about 5 to 10 minutes. Oh, it was only 5 to 10 minutes? Okay. That's very interesting. I must have hit the wrong button, but let me check with the comments. Am I back on now? Not at all. Not all morning, just the last 4 or 5 minutes. Okay. Well, all right. So I'm back on now. Lost you at railroads. What a shame. Um, well, I've got a few minutes left. Let's read American railroads were public projects. This is the point I was trying to make was the railroads themselves are public projects, and the profit that has been made from them has gone into private hands since the robber barons. So let's go ahead and read this. I'm on page 321 now, and I'll look at this show later and see what I might have missed. But let's continue. American railroads were public projects. It is now nearly 2 centuries since the invention of railroads. Though Britain preceded America in railroad technology by a few years, U.S. rail development quickly expanded into a national network whose mileage surpassed all of Europe. Railways were the arteries of that extraordinary 19th century U.S. industrial progress. They collapsed in the post industrial disaster of the late 20th century. And that's true. We have had a post industrial disaster in the late 20th century. That's why we're not making money. And that's why we're not progressing anymore because we've had uh, our industrial base taken out from underneath us. Intelligent Americans today look wistfully at the advanced high speed rail systems of China, Japan, and Europe, wishing their own country could emulate foreign success. But opponents of modern rail systems will often smugly pose the rhetorical question, quote, how are you going to pay for it, unquote. This will usually stop the discussion due to general historical ignorance of the subject. There is an obvious prior question to be asked. How were the railroads built in the past? The fact is that American railroads were sponsored by the government, federal, state, and local, with crucial aid from the Army engineers. Though most railroads were privately owned, their initiation and funding were mostly organized through government action. And the military discipline instilled at West Point was directly transmitted to the railroads by the engineers who designed the first American rail routes and who brought order and punctuality to railroad management. Before submitting blindly to the assertion that building really new transportation as a public project would bankrupt the country, one ought to know how such a publicly sponsored innovation helped make the USA rich and powerful. The popular conception of American railroad history as a saga of corruption by Wall Street robber barons dates from the late 19th century, when financiers who had not built them took over and began looting railroads and other industries. But how did the enterprises based on this new technology actually begin? We will present here an account of the founding of some leading railroad companies and locomotive manufacturers, along with the government funding and Army engineering that made this revolutionary improvement possible. The B&O, public funding, Army expertise. The first American railroad for public use, the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O, was established as a community enterprise by a group of local merchants, by the state of Maryland, and by the city of Baltimore. The project was driven by anxiety that New York and Pennsylvania would dominate trade to the Midwest, but the works of all three states exponentially enlarged the country's wealth and resources. The Maryland legislature passed the B&O Company Charter on February 27, 1827, reserving to the state and to Baltimore together 50% of the shares to be issued to fund the startup. These governments were represented with 2 directors each on the corporate board. Thousands of citizens enthusiastically subscribed when the books were opened for share sales. As of mid-1829, the 11 largest individual shareholders together owned about 19% of the company's stock. The largest individual stake was less than 4%. A Quaker hardware merchant and local banker named Philip E. Thomas and his brother Evan Thomas together formed the idea of a railroad from Baltimore to the Ohio River. They and engineers they consulted had read William Strickland's precise account of British locomotives, rails, metallurgy, and road engineering. Evan Thomas went to England to see this experimental technology for himself. Philip Thomas brought in merchant banker George Brown and a set of local businessmen to help shape the enterprise and apply for government banking. Yes, George Brown of Baltimore, George Brown of the future Brown Brothers Harriman. The Adams administration eagerly responded to the B&O's request for engineering assistance. Under the authority of the 1824 General Survey Act, Secretary of War Barbour assigned Army engineers to survey potential routes and design the railroad. Barbour stipulated that the U.S. government would pay for the surveys since the project was of national importance. 3 engineering parties carried out an initial reconnaissance. One was headed by Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Stephen H. Long, General Swift's recruit and former assistant, renowned for his Western expeditions and his pioneering work in Illinois. A second party was directed by Captain William Gibbs McNeill, an 1817 graduate whom Swift had personally guided into and through West Point. Dr. William Howard, a civil engineer employed by the Engineer Department under the Secretary of War, ran the third initial survey group. They confirmed the practicability of the project. The engineers concluded that the best route for the track would be through the valley of the Patapsco River and then to Point of Rocks, where the Potomac River passed Catoctin Mountain. The company enthusiastically accepted the engineer's recommendation. Construction would begin at once. Secretary Barbour agreed to release Jonathan Knight from his War Department service as survey chief for the National Road to join President Philip Thomas and Stephen Long on the B&O Engineering Board. During 1828, U.S. Army topographical engineers prepared construction by surveying the rail's entire projected road from Baltimore to the Ohio River. The B&O meanwhile employed Lieutenant George Washington Whistler, General Swift's brother-in-law and an intimate friend of McNeill, as associate engineer. The company sent Knight, McNeill, Whistler, and railcar equipment inventor Ross Winans to Britain to examine the construction and locomotive power for the railroads then in operation or in the design phase. As with William Strickland before them, the English professional engineers treated these visiting Americans with respect and friendliness, regardless of the inveterate hostile attitude of Britain's imperial rulers toward their country. Captain McNeill established regulations for the company's engineering department, including personal and financial accounting, similar to those for the Army Corps of Engineers itself. This military influence set the pattern for U.S. railroads. The first mile of track for passenger cars in the United States was laid for the B&O, with George Washington Whistler in charge of construction in 1829. Passenger service began in May 1830 on the first 13 miles of track, built thus under Army supervision between Baltimore and what is now Ellicott City, Maryland. And by the way, that little Ellicott City train station is still there. At that point, a dispute arose, with Whistler claiming contract violations by an employee. The company dissolved its engineering board, and the Army personnel were reassigned to other projects. But the U.S. military had by then supplied the expertise to completely design this pioneering enterprise and to successfully launch construction of a commercially viable railway. When the Baltimore and Ohio opened for business, the American railroad age had begun. William Gibbs McNeill and George Washington Whistler went on to be joint managing engineers for creation of several new rail lines. The former West Point classmates, both protégés of Chief Engineer Joseph Gardner Swift, had studied descriptive geometry together under Claudius Crozet and graduated together in 1819. Whistler married Swift's sister Mary in 1821. Whistler married McNeill's sister Anna in 1831 after Mary died. Their son, James McNeill Whistler, was the famous artist who depicted his mother, Anna, in the painting, which came to be known as Whistler's Mother. The painter's father, Army engineer George Washington Whistler, was himself the most famous in his own lifetime, chiefly because of a vast project in Russia, which will be discussed in the next chapter. While the B&O project was being built, President John Quincy Adams deployed Army personnel to start up railroads in New York, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina until the end of his presidency in 1829. His successor, President Andrew Jackson, gradually emerged as an enemy of government economic activities. But in his first term, Jackson continued Adams's initiative of assigning Army engineers to plan railroads. As a senator back in 1824, Jackson himself had voted for the General Survey Act, and the program was widely popular. Its high point was reached in 1835 when some 20 U.S. railroads were using active duty Army personnel in their construction and management. The General Survey Act was repealed in 1838 under the administration of Martin Van Buren. This attack on American economic development followed soon after the destruction of the nationalist-run Bank of the United States, a course of action promoted by Van Buren and his faction aligned with British and Wall Street bankers. Army officers were ordered to cease aiding railroad construction. Active duty personnel did not resume this role until the 1850s in the preliminary surveying for a transcontinental railroad. Although railroad companies were mostly private enterprises, state and local governments, and later the federal government subsidized all the significant rail lines with public money and credit, using loans, grants, stock purchases, and other means. This public funding was essential. The biggest private financiers would not invest in constructing such enterprises, and the smaller investors could not sustain projects of such scope and duration without public money and guarantees. The result of this national commitment were spectacular. By 1840, after a decade of construction, the United States had about 3,000 miles of railways in operation, as compared to 1,800 miles in all of Europe, including Britain. Well, the next section is about the foundries. The foundry powers the trains, and it is about how did we make those locomotives. Well, we'll save that one for our next reading, which I plan to make next Monday at the usual time, 11 a.m. Sorry about the interruption. We will edit that out. And thanks for being with us, and thanks for following the story of Anton Chaikin's book, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress, from Franklin to Kennedy.